This is a re-recording of a talk that I gave at Princeton on the 6th of December. If you're looking for the original, you can find it in the same playlist that you found this video, or I'll put a link in the description. The question of my talk is it morally wrong for a man to claim to be a woman? In the abstract I sent in advance, I promised 2 parts to the talk. The first presenting arguments that it is wrong, the second presenting arguments that men have a right to do it, so it can't be wrong. But when I presented this as a practice talk, I got the very strong feedback that I had 2 separate papers stuck together and that I should focus on what I had been considering as the first part, because that's where the more surprising and controversial arguments are. So that's what I will do, although I will end by talking about one of the arguments from what I had been considering the second part of the talk. And I'll focus specifically on the feminist case against men claiming to be women, rather than making a more general case. The feminist case involves arguments that are specifically about women's interests, while a more general case might refer to, say, gay men's interests, children's interests, and or general societal interests, for example, what liberalism requires. Before we get into the arguments, it's important to try to resolve some ambiguity in my question. There is disagreement over what the terms man and woman refer to. Gender-critical people think that a man is an adult human male and a woman is an adult human female. So they'll hear my question as, is it morally wrong for a male to claim to be a female? In case it needs saying, they'll also think male and female are biological categories. While some people believe in change of sex and some trans women do claim to be female, that would be an unduly narrow interpretation of the question. It would limit our discussion to what's morally wrong with claiming to be a sex that you are not, and so sidestep the bulk of what trans women and the trans activist movement and its supporters are actually claiming. Trans activists, on the other hand, think that the words woman and female both refer to gender identity, and the same goes for man and male. So they'll hear my question as, is it morally wrong for someone with a man gender identity to claim to have a woman gender identity? And that question will seem incoherent. Someone with a man gender identity precisely doesn't claim to have a woman gender identity. It's hard to even state the issue. So we need to both be not unduly narrow and able to actually state the issue. There are at least 3 things that might matter for the question: sex, gender, and gender identity. The argument over whether trans women are women is confused by people using the word woman for all and any of these 3 things. So a male might claim to be female, that's a sex claim. To be a person subject to the norms of femininity in virtue of femaleness, that's a claim about gender as the second wave has understood it. And or to identify as female or a woman, that's a claim about gender identity. Although trans activists think gender is gender identity, so they would say it's a claim about gender. So we can try to resolve the ambiguity with these more specific versions of my question. Is it morally wrong for a male to claim to be female? Is it morally wrong for a male to claim to have been subjected to norms of femininity in virtue of femaleness? Is it morally wrong for a male to claim a woman identity? Now most, although not all, of the men who claim to be female are simply using female and woman synonymously as gender terms on their preferred conception of gender, rather than making a claim to be biologically female. Although some seem to confuse biological sex and legal sex, saying, for example, I am female because that's what it says on my driver's license, and others seem to believe in change of sex, for example, through having so-called sex reassignment surgery or taking so-called cross-sex hormones. Similarly, most of the men who claim to be women don't quite claim to have been subjected to norms of femininity in virtue of femaleness. It's more that they have a different conception of gender in mind and take the word woman to refer to that conception. Then that they share the conception of gender with the second waivers and claim that it applies to them. Some may wish that it applied to them, or as Catherine Jenkins has argued, may take the norms to apply to them, and yet not strictly claim that they have been subjected to those norms. Part of what it is to articulate how they have been wronged requires that they haven't been subjected to those norms, because people treat them according to the norms corresponding to their sex rather than their identity. So probably we should be most interested in the third disambiguation, but be open to versions of the first that mean something other than biological sex by the word female, and versions of the second that use woman to refer to some external or objective conception of gender that may yet be generous enough to include at least some trans women. So my goal for the paper is to try and answer yes, it is wrong on any of these three disambiguations. And because it's important for me to mark that my interest is in the claims to femaleness/womanhood made by biological males, and I want to keep that absolutely clear rather than obscuring it with language that suggests that the biological male is female or a woman, I'll use male pronouns for males throughout the talk. Now, onto the feminist arguments for why it is morally wrong for a male to A, claim to be female, B, claim to have been subjected to the norms of femininity in virtue of femaleness, and or C, claim to have a woman identity. This is all going to get cumbersome, so I'll just say something like claim to be a woman in the rest of the talk. I want to discuss 4 arguments. These are that it is morally wrong for a man to claim to be a woman because 1, it is inconsistent with a feminist understanding of what a woman is. 2, it involves conceptual and linguistic appropriation. 3, it offers an individual solution to a social problem, and in doing so neutralizes critics and rebels. And 4, it expresses disrespect to women and women's experiences under patriarchy. So let's take these in order. First, it is inconsistent with a feminist understanding of what a woman is. When a man states publicly that he is a woman, this statement, in conjunction with other aspects of his presentation, comportment, behavior, and so on, express or suggest an understanding of what a woman is, or what woman means. This is not a point about what's in his head. He might have no particular theory of womanness, no particular beliefs about what he and all the other women have in common, or if they don't have anything in common, what nonetheless makes it the case that they're all women. If this understanding of what a woman is that his statement and associated self-expression express or suggest are anti-feminist or otherwise incompatible with feminist politics, then, at least insofar as we support feminism, which I do, we're justified in rejecting his claim. So we will be saying, effectively, no, you are not a woman because that is not what woman means. I'll take the desiderata for a feminist understanding of what a woman is to be that it identifies a non-gerrymandered or ad hoc constituency and makes it comprehensible why this group needs a focused political advocacy. And I'll leave open whether this is for largely historical reasons or for contemporary reasons. Now compare this with something like the idea of being a children's rights advocate. Children picks out a clear constituency of everyone below the age of legal adulthood. Arguments at the margins about who is and isn't a child don't affect the obvious point that there are children. Once we know it's children whose rights we're interested in, we can start thinking about the specific vulnerabilities of children and which rights shortfalls they might relate to. And it can be that only a small number of children actually have their rights compromised, and yet it still makes sense to work for children's rights. So too for feminism and women's rights/women's liberation. So here are a number of understandings of woman that a man's statement that he is a woman, combined with his self-expression, could suggest. A woman is a person with a female mind, whether that mind is encased in a male or a female body. B, a woman is a person with a female typical hormone level. C. A woman is a person with a vagina or near a vagina. A woman is a person with breasts. A woman is a person with female typical secondary sex characteristics. D. A woman is any person who is sufficiently feminine. E. A woman is anyone marked out as a thing to fuck. F. A woman is the helpmate of a man. And G. A woman is anyone who says they are a woman. Most of these claims have or have had some expression in trans politics. The exception is F. So A is a version of trapped in the wrong body, which was a common claim made on behalf of trans people, although the movement has mostly moved away from that claim now. B is a claim made by the International Olympic Committee and some other sporting bodies dealing with males who want to compete in elite sports in the women's category. The first part of C is expressed by the historical idea that to become a woman required so-called sex reassignment surgery. Again, trans activists have mostly moved away from this claim now, but it was common for many decades. The second and third parts of C are expressed by the idea, still common today, that to become a woman requires taking so-called cross-sex hormones. D is one way of understanding the claim that being a feminine boy is a marker of transness. And E relates to trans woman Andrea Long-Chu's notorious claim that sissy porn made him trans, as well as some things trans women inclusive radical feminist Catherine McKinnon has said recently about why she thinks trans women are women. And finally, G is the explicit and predominant claim of the contemporary trans activist movement. So our question is, should feminists accept any of these claims, A through G? A and B both trade on the idea that there are two distinct types of persons, where the types involve categorical psychological and behavioral differences. Differences in, for example, preferences, attitudes, choices, behaviors, emotions, and so on. They just offer a different naturalized basis for these two types. In one case, sexed brains, in the other case, the so-called sex hormones. And both of these ideas are empirically false. There are average differences of this type between males and females, but there are not two distinct and non-overlapping types of person. Both of these ideas are empirically false. There are average differences of this type between males and females, but there are not two distinct and non-overlapping types of person. And more importantly, these differences may be entirely contingent. At issue between opponents is the explanation of the differences, and whether they reveal sexed natures or only sexed socialization and enculturation. As second-wave radical feminist Janice Raymond put it, a female mind in a male body only makes sense as a concept in a society that accepts the reality of both. Or as second-wave liberal feminist Gloria Steinem wrote, transsexuals are paying an extreme tribute to the power of sex roles. Anything to win from this biased society where minor differences of hormones and genitals are supposed to dictate total lives and personalities, the right to be who they individually are as human beings. Feminists are trying to move away from the idea that there are two distinct types of persons, again, where types tracks psychological and behavioral differences, not mere biological differences. So it is not in their interest to accept either A or B. The extent to which C is objectionable depends on whether it is a minimalist claim about biological difference or more. Misogynistic men may see women as largely interchangeable things that have these parts, a vagina or breasts or a satisfactory waist-to-hip ratio. Feminists work for the understanding that women are full human beings, not just these sexualized body parts. It's not in feminists' interests to accept an understanding of what a woman is that depends on sexualized body parts. It may be in feminists' interest to accept an understanding of what a woman is that relies on body parts in the strictly biological sense. But if it's biological difference that's being tracked, it would matter why we're tracking it. and this might have implications for how we should consider endogenous versus exogenous body parts, that is, natural body parts versus body parts constructed through surgical or medical interventions. What about D? Setting aside the question of where to set the threshold for sufficient femininity, here we again have the idea that there are two distinct types of persons, feminine and masculine, where the feminine people are the women, the masculine people the men. If we divide the world by reproductive biology, then we have two categories, male and female, which we might also use man and woman for. If we divide the world by gender expression, or something like it, then we have two different categories, feminine and masculine, which people of either sex can belong to. If all the sufficiently feminine people are women, then at least all the trans women who are sufficiently feminine will be women. Again, we can ask whether this is an understanding of woman that feminists should be happy to accept. What is a feminist understanding of the relation between femininity and being a woman? Feminists since Simone de Beauvoir have worked to reveal femininity as socialized and to decouple femininity from femaleness. Second wave radical feminist Mary Daly argued that the idea of trans women as naturally feminine men reinforces the idea of a natural femininity, which distracts from the fact that femininity is a male construction imposed on female people. She wrote, "Male propagation of the idea that men too are feminine, particularly through feminine behavior by males, distracts attention from the fact that femininity is a man-made construction, having essentially nothing to do with femaleness." Second wave feminist Germaine Greer memorably said that femininity is the fake version of femaleness. Female is real and it's sex, and femininity is unreal and it's gender. It's a role you play. Of these two understandings of what a woman is, one being a female person no matter what she is like, and the other being a feminine person no matter what sex they are, the former is more feminist. The former tells every female person that there's no way she should be just because she is female. She can wear any clothes and have any hairstyle and do any job and have any sort of character, and she is still a woman. The latter tells a man that if he is feminine, he must be a woman, and tells a woman that if she is masculine, she must not be a woman. But what is the point of that? Is there some pressing reason to recategorize the world into masculine and feminine persons regardless of sex? One reason might be that it is good for trans people who want to be recognized as the opposite sex/gender. But if it is good for trans people and bad for women, then feminists have no reason to accept it. Indeed, given that there are so many more women than trans people, arguably no one has reason to accept it. There's just my slide of some non-feminine women. I think this was a campaign against manspreading. Okay, moving on to E. In discussing the medical approach to males with androgen insensitivity disorder, Greer wrote, "Many, but not all, have vaginas surgically constructed for them so that they can function as normal, i.e. heterosexual females. This implies a curious attitude to females as simply bodies with clefts in for the accommodation of a penis." Some prominent trans women have been explicit about their desire for sexual subordination. I mentioned Long Chu already. The understanding of woman as a thing to fuck also has some currency in popular culture. For example, in the most recent season of And Just Like That, which is the revival of Sex and the City, a gay male character objects to being penetrated by his new lover on the grounds that he is not the woman. So this approximates thinking about women as a very specific social role, dividing people up into the one who fucks, that's the man, and the one who is fucked, that's the woman. Sexual roles in men's prisons, for example, can then be taken to demarcate men and women. Trans women sex workers may then more readily be designated as women. I'll respond to E and F together, so let me first say that F has similar latitude in accommodating at least some trans women. Second wave feminist Marilyn Frye described women as a category of oppressed people paired up with men to provide them personal service, sexual service, and ego/emotional service. Think of your average 1950s housewife. If we say that woman is the helpmate of man, then woman is again a social role, and some males can occupy that social role. It would be like saying the woman is the stay-at-home parent, and so calling all stay-at-home dads women. There might well be some men in the helpmate of a man role, not limited to trans women. So on this view too, some men can turn out to be women. As a side note here, because there are many ways to describe woman as a social role, there are many potential substitutes for E and F. I've just included what I think are two interesting versions, both of which got a lot of uptake among feminists in the second wave. So should feminists support the understanding of what a woman is in E or F? There's a tension here because when feminists describe negative stereotypes or constraining social roles, they do so in order to decouple these stereotypes and roles from women and to resist them. Feminists do not believe that a woman really is a thing to fuck. They believe that some people believe that a woman is just a thing to fuck, and they want to dispel that belief and introduce an understanding of women as full human persons. So too for the idea that woman is the helpmate of a man. What they are effectively saying is females are not women, at least not the way that you understand woman. So I think what we should say about E and F comes down to whether we are happy to be woman abolitionists. I am not. So I think woman is the name of she who has been stereotyped, socialized, etc., and not the name of the successfully stereotyped, socialized, and so on creature. I think when we talk about women's liberation, we imagine liberated women rather than no women at all. But thinking about gender as a type of social class following the Marxist tradition has led some people to think of women in the same way they might think about a category like slave. And of course we are slave abolitionists. So if woman is just the name of all the bad stuff that has been done to females, or all the bad things females have been made into, then we should be women abolitionists. And calling someone a woman is just to make a descriptive claim about who is a member of that class. On some ways of describing the class, there might be some biological males in it. Then the man's claim to be a woman couldn't be morally wrong because it might well be descriptively true. So only if we reject woman abolitionism and retain woman as the word for she who has been stereotyped, socialized, etc., can we reject E and F as feminist understandings of what a woman is. I think we should reject woman abolitionism, so we should reject E and F, but I concede that there is reasonable disagreement here. What I can add though is that if this is what is being expressed by men when they claim to be women, it had better be true that they're members of the class, and they had better be lamenting their membership. And there is reason to doubt both of these things. So suppose woman names the helpmate of a man, then any trans woman claiming to be a woman had better be the helpmate of a man, or a person expected to be or socialized into being, and so on, the helpmate of a man. For any of the versions of E and F we can come up with, they're highly unlikely to be true of all, or I think even most trans women. More importantly, when trans women say they're women, this is not usually delivered as a lamentation. So compare someone who is not a Jew, but is often assumed to be one, declaring that they are a Jew on the grounds that they are routinely subject to anti-Semitism. They would not be celebrating this fact. They would be lamenting anti-Semitism and seeking an end to both their and Jews' social mistreatment. Trans identifications, in contrast, are usually celebrated as a finding of one's authentic self, and they're generally affirmed. So this is not remotely the tone of, alas, I too am a slave. Okay, finally, G. self-identification as a woman. This view is attractive because it is inclusive. It counts almost everyone as a woman who wants to be counted as a woman, and doesn't count anyone as a woman who doesn't want to be counted as a woman. It produces the verdict that trans women are women. But it comes at a high price, namely creating a gerrymandered social category made up of people who have nothing in common beyond what they are willing to say, and not even what they mean by what they are willing to say. It thus violates one of the desiderata that we started with for a feminist understanding of what a woman is. Feminists have an interest in a constituency that has something in common, in order for there to be a political project worth pursuing. And that does not mean that every woman must have experienced the same treatment, but it does mean we need to be able to pick out whose treatment we are interested in and offer articulations of that treatment. And one clear and consistent way to do this is to take the constituency of feminism to be female people. Feminists can talk about how this group has been treated throughout history and why, and fight for better treatment through political activities. Compare again the earlier description of a children's rights advocate. What could be the justification for a politics for the group of anyone who identifies as a woman? One of the most serious impacts of the self-identification view of sex/gender is that it is eroding the important distinction between sex and gender identity in multiple countries. A man who identifies as a woman is not female, but in some countries that distinction is impossible or at least very difficult to draw. In Victoria, my state in Australia, any man with a woman gender identity is taken to be legally entitled to the protections of the opposite sex. Whether this is good, bad, or neutral for women is of course contested, most vigorously in the UK, but it raises questions about the conflicts of interest for a range of previously sex-separated spaces, services, and provisions. Serious questions arise for prisons, sports, support groups like domestic violence, trauma, and addiction recovery groups, preferential hiring, and lesbian dating, for example. So if it is not in women's interests to have men in women-only spaces or accessing women-only services and provisions, then it is not in women's interests to accept men's claims to be women. In sum, for argument one, either there is some understanding of what a woman is expressed by some men's claims to be women that is not incompatible with feminist politics, and I just happen to have overlooked, or adult human female is the only understanding of what a woman is compatible with feminist politics. Okay, now I want to say something about the concept of gender in the sex-gender distinction, which is argument 2. The sex-gender distinction was one of the most important conceptual innovations of the second wave of feminism. It actually shows up much earlier in feminist history, but it just isn't called that. Let's set that detail aside. The sex-gender distinction allowed feminists to separate woman as she really was, or could be, or could have been, from woman as she had been made to be under patriarchy. Theorizing gender meant theorizing the social construction of femininity and the ways in which it shaped women in men's interests. Rejecting gender meant rejecting and trying to dismantle this social construction. Hence, some second wavers calling themselves gender abolitionists or gender eliminationists. When trans activists come along and insist that gender is instead an identity, they turn a crucial political concept that has been used to advance women's liberation into something very different. Philosophers love to talk about hermeneutical injustice. What could be a more central case than defanging the central concept of a group's liberation politics? With this conceptual and linguistic appropriation, trans activists undercut abolitionism by remaking the thing that has oppressed women into a thing that is indispensable to the self-conception of another minority. And this is confusing for progressives. Should they be against gender because it is bad for women, or for gender because it is important to trans people? It forces people to choose, And because considerable progress has been made on feminism and trans people are a smaller and more novel group, trans people are more likely to be given uptake. The remaking of gender into an identity is against women's interests, and so something feminists have reason to reject, which makes it all the more surprising that they have instead generally accepted and embraced it. Moving on to the third argument. Janice Raymond's argument in The Transsexual Empire is that trans politics has turned a social problem into an individual one. The social problem was gender, stratifying people on the basis of sex into narrow behavioral categories. The individual solution was to designate those most unable to live with that stratification as transgender, offering medical and surgical interventions to enable a small number of people to switch categories. Steinem writes of Raymond that she mourns the loss of individuals who might have acted as critics and rebels in this sexually stereotyped society. Instead of accepting the idea of a female mind and a male body, they might have challenged the very idea that there is such a thing as a female or male mind. They might have demonstrated that sex is only one of many elements that makes up each unique individual. So this is a point about the loss of trans people as critics and rebels against gender, but the same point can be made about women. Gender nonconforming women who might have acted as first movers in loosening the constraints of femininity for all women are reinterpreted by trans activism as trans. Feminism loses critics and rebels. Because it is in women's interest for there to be a strong feminist movement, and because a strong feminist movement needs to keep its eye on the social problem, it is not in feminists' interest to accept the claim that a gender nonconforming or otherwise gender atypical woman is not a woman, or that a gender nonconforming or otherwise gender atypical man is not a man. The feminist must insist that there's no right way to be a woman, not accept that some ways of being a woman, for example, masculine presentation or same-sex attraction, make you a man. Finally, the fourth argument. Men claiming to be women expresses disrespect to women. Male/female and man/woman are antagonistic categories in feminist analysis. Qua sex/gender, he is the oppressor and she is the oppressed. Some people don't like these words. Any similar antagonism like advantage-disadvantaged, dominant-subordinate, majority-minority, with minority used in the non-numerical technical sense, any of these substitutions will do. So when a man claims to be a woman, he is, in my language, the oppressor claiming to be the oppressed. Anything he can identify with or desire that she has and he lacks is either straightforwardly impossible for him to have, for example, the capacity for pregnancy, or it confuses who she has been constructed to be under patriarchy with who she really is. So for example, suppose he desires to be pretty and decorative, to be gazed at by men as a beauty object. He's envious that women can have these experiences and men cannot. If he desires to be a woman for that reason, then he confuses her patriarchal construction as a beauty object with her real nature as a full human person, and this is demeaning and offensive to her. More generally, it is offensive for those who have the social power to avoid a specific type of negative treatment, or the risk of it, to nonetheless choose it and then claim to be equally affected by it. She did not have the luxury to opt in or out of that treatment. And just to compare, here are some comments from the Netflix documentary The Racial Divide about Rachel Dolezal and the Fifth Estate program investigating Buffy Sainte-Marie. Sainte-Marie being a white American who identified throughout a long music career as Canadian First Nations. I can't see why the same sentiment doesn't apply to men claiming to be women. So for example, it's not a hairstyle, it's not an affinity for music. She didn't go through what we went through. Sort of list down the bottom there of the types of discrimination that African American women face that Dolezal did not. Then from the Investigating Buffy Sainte-Marie documentary, they're taking that opportunity from a real Indigenous person. They get a benefit, sometimes a huge benefit. These are grants, awards, and positions they would never have gotten otherwise. It's unacceptable for non-Indigenous people to speak for Indigenous people. It's a theft of opportunities and resources. It's a theft of our stories. People claiming Indigenous identity falsely are taking up a lot of space where actual Native people should be. It articulates an attitude where people think it's okay to take everything from us, land, resources, spiritual practices, and now our very souls through identity. I said earlier that the part 2 I'd promised in my abstract was going to become a separate paper. But I will just say something brief about one of the ideas there, which is the defense of agential identity from Robin Dembroff and Catherine St. Croix's 2019 Ergo paper. Their basic idea is that there's a relation between 3 things: our private identity, our agential identity, and our public identity, which they also call social position. So the first and last of these are what they sound like, namely how we think of ourselves and how others think of us. So I could be a closet lesbian who is publicly considered straight, so my private identity would be lesbian and my public identity would be straight. Agential identities in Dembroff and St. Croix's view are the kind of bridge that help us to make our private identities into public identities through exercises of our agency. If that exercise works, then all 3 of my types of identity become the same. And if it doesn't, then my private identity and my agential identity become the same, but my public identity remains what it is. Dembroff and St. Croix think agential identity is important because it is a crucial part of self-determination. And as such, they assert that others have a prima facie obligation to allow and respect an individual's determination of the social positions they occupy. They go on, the exercise of agency that is central to agential identities is morally significant in its own right, and, unless defeated by other considerations, ought not to be prevented. So of course, the question for the gender-critical feminist is a man's exercise of agency aimed at aligning his private identity as a woman with the public identity or social position of a woman defeated by other considerations? Dembroff and St. Croix think answering this question in general depends on whether the private identity in question should be given uptake. And they give 2 examples where it might reasonably be rejected. One of which is Dolezal's claim to be black, which we just talked about, and the other of which is Dutch man Emil Ratelband's claim to identify as 49 and want this recognized in law. He was actually 69, but healthy and facing dating and hiring discrimination. Now, Dembroff and St. Croix acknowledge that recognizing and accommodating agential identities can have significant implications. They worry that accepting Dolezal's identity as black would require revision of racial categories, shifting away from current understanding on which race is at least partly a matter of ancestry toward a version on which race is a matter of desire and personal sentiment. They worry that accepting Ratelband's identity as 20 years younger would require a rethinking of many of the legal and practical rights and obligations that track records of age, including age limits surrounding drinking, marriage, voting, retirement, and so on. It is baffling to me that they can say these things about race and age and yet proceed as if they don't apply equally to sex. Why is it not okay to make race a matter of desire and personal sentiment, but okay to do this to sex? Why should we worry about the legal and practical impacts of self-identification of age and not worry about them for self-identification of sex? Surely letting men into women's prisons or hiring men under preferential hiring schemes for women is just as serious in terms of legal and practical impacts. Of course, I can't conclude on this basis that there are no adequate defenses of the man's right to claim to be a woman. I can only say that this one is pretty unconvincing.